So folks, welcome to another session on human resources for small business. Today I've got Paul Maguire with me, and Paul's going to share some of his wisdom, expertise and knowledge with us in relation to human resources in a small business. In terms of formal introduction, Paul is the principal lawyer of Maguire Legal. He's the author of a best-selling book, HR for Small Business for Dummies. Is that correct, Paul?
That's correct, Kevin.
And I think Wiley is the publisher for that.
They certainly are.
And Paul's an expert in relation to employment and workplace relations. So great to be with you again, Paul, and really looking forward to our session today. I know you've been giving this some considerable thought. So what have you got planned to talk about today with us?
Okay, thank you, Kevin, and thank you for those who are listening. What I'd like to talk about today is some changes to the law in Australia, in particular surrounding sexual harassment, sexual assault and sex-based discrimination. In particular, there's now a new positive duty to prevent, as far as practical, and to take proportionate measures, use the legal terminology, to prevent sexual harassment, sexual assault, sex-based discrimination and victimisation. This positive duty is something that I think all small business owners and managers need to be aware of. So I just wanted to go through some of the principles, some of the strategies that need to be adopted on this particular topic. And I'll also just talk about, as part of that, Kevin, there's a new concept in town, and that is called a hostile work environment.
Goodness.
Have you heard of that before?
No.
Well, it's been introduced to the law, and small business employers will have to think about how this impacts on their responsibilities.
This is incredible.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Look, the new laws are being made by the Australian Parliament, so the state-based anti-discrimination laws, they're unchanged. They're still there, still sitting there, and it's still unlawful to discriminate on the basis of sex amongst all the other characteristics and provisions. But look, if we can zero in on this positive duty, I think there's a few takeaways for the listeners, Kevin, that would be useful in managing their business, and in particular minimising, if not eliminating completely, but certainly minimising risks of liability, because there's certainly some strong penalties being included in the law now for breaches, and the unsuspecting small business owner may fall foul of the law. So I'm happy to kick it off, unless you've got some specific questions you thought was worth tackling, Kevin.
Well, Paul, in terms of some of your comments you made in the introduction, the notion of positive duty, which is overarching the sexual harassment notion of discrimination in a workplace. Initially, I'm starting to think small businesses out there, with the myriad of issues they've got to deal with when it comes to employee relations, employing people, etc. Here's another layer of complexity, or potentially another layer of complexity and consideration. What comes to my mind is, if this positive duty is going to be applied with the sexual harassment area, what about other areas of discrimination such as race, age, industrial activities, colour, etc., etc.?
Excellent point, Kevin. Look, the best way to think about this positive duty is the same way that you would think about the duty of care to ensure the health, safety and welfare of employees in your workplace. In fact, it's framed in a very similar way. So I think it's important to, I suppose, understand it within the context, including those other characteristics, the anti-discrimination characteristics, but in particular the strategies that you'll need to employ really need to be thought about similar to health and safety. So if I can summarise, I suppose, the positive duty really means that the employers must actively prevent harm. That is, harm that can happen from sexual harassment or sex-based discrimination or victimisation of someone in the workplace, by way of things such as staff training, creating a positive culture, implementing policies and procedures. Yes, the old policies and procedures. And really to ongoing monitoring of the workplace culture to ensure that there is no escalation or whatever measures you put in place that you minimise the risk of such escalation or problems occurring. So that's really the approach you need to take to it.
So definitely a theme of minimising that risk.
Yeah, it is. Look,
Exposure.
it is. Yeah, look, the positive duty also, lawyers also talk about the concept of vicarious liability. And what that means is that the actions of your employees and the people in your workplace, whether you agree, disagree, promote or otherwise, you're liable for their actions as much as if you perpetrated a discrimination or you sexually harassed someone. So the positive duty is basically the same. And that is, it says, look, we're all in this together. We're all responsible. And so myself as the employer, the owner, my responsibility is to take whatever measures I can that are practical within my area of responsibility to ensure that these sorts of things don't happen in the workplace. And if they do, then you address them immediately. So what can happen? What can you do, Kevin? Well, I know I keep coming back to these things and it's often a similar theme, but policies and procedures are really important. So if you think about it from this point of view, it says, all right, you've probably got a sexual harassment policy there at the moment. Have a look at it again. Often good to just revisit these. And also, depending on what type of employee you are, you may have a regular get-together on a Monday, a monthly. You might have a staff conference. For those in the blue-collar areas, you might have toolbox talks on a regular basis about work, where you can use that time to introduce this topic, okay? And along with other ones, and that's where the opportunity is. So, one, it's very nice to have the policy, but you've got to educate people to it, Kevin.
Indeed. And if your meetings are regular, if your seminars and conferences are regular, then if there's any updates to these policies and procedures, they can be looked at and discussed and trained in those sorts of forms.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, us lawyers love a trail of evidence, Kevin, as you know.
Yes.
And so having a record of who attended and what was discussed, it doesn't have to be a transcript, but at least you've got some paper trail to indicate that you have educated the staff so that you can demonstrate, if need be, if ever challenged on this, that you can demonstrate that you have taken proportionate measures within the realm of what you're able to do by having these sessions, having the policy in place. And if someone goes rogue, there are incidents and they will happen, then at least you can demonstrate that you've acted then. The other end of that, Kevin, of course, is, well, what about if an incident occurs? Well, I think most people and most small businesses will understand now that the duty and responsibility is to try and mediate and or address those issues as and when they arise. The positive duty doesn't change that. Hostile work environment's a new concept which is worth talking about. I'll get on to that in a minute, I suppose.
Please do, yeah.
Okay. Well, hostile work environment. What that is that there can be a culture, and it can be the usual suspects and the usual examples. That is, there's a lot of sexual-based talk, innuendo. There could be a culture either online through social media or directly at work, or even in a social setting outside of work that for one reason or another may in fact encourage sexual harassment or comments about people based on their sex. Okay. Now, I think we've grown up and we've known over the last 20 years is that they're largely a no-no. What's happened, Kevin, is that under the Sex Discrimination Act, they've now introduced a legal concept of a hostile work environment. It's effectively the same as a culture which leads to that sort of harassment. So there is the positive duty extends on employers now to address what are potentially hostile work environments. Much more difficult to address, of course, whether that's fair or otherwise employers, it really doesn't matter. It's now in place. So if you exercise the sorts of practical measures that we've just mentioned around the positive duty, that should also address matters of culture. The only other element I'd add to it, I suppose, and this will be one of the takeaways, is leadership's really important, Kevin. I think you know that in your working life.
Indeed. And in terms of leadership's important, so for the small business owner-operator, leadership, correct me if I'm wrong, would that be the manager, the owner?
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. And look, having a fun workplace is, I think, pretty important. We don't want it to be sterile, and we all want to get along and encourage people. But ultimately, the manager has to step back and has to, I suppose, ensure that they're the adult in the room in some instances. And that's certainly one of the key takeaways. And probably, look, I don't want to labour the point, Kevin, probably wind this up with really 5 key points, takeaways for small business, if you like. And that is that, firstly, that a safe work environment is everyone's responsibility, and the positive duty to address issues of sexual harassment, sex-based discrimination and victimisation is everyone's responsibility. So that needs to be emphasised. Ultimately, it does come back to the employer, so the employer must take responsibility. And have a look at your workplace. Have a think about, is it a hostile work environment? If so, then think about the measures you'd need to take to that, including the culture, to improve the culture, and make sure you educate and have the policies and procedures in place. So they're the key takeaways, Kevin.
Excellent.
If you do that, hopefully you should be okay.
Yeah, some of them pretty challenging, I guess, for a lot of people in terms of looking at your own business from a critical view with regards to culture. And it's pretty hard for a lot of us to admit that culture's potentially not good, or culture could be improved. And that's part of leadership, I guess. And
it is indeed. And sometimes, Kevin, having dealt with all those particular matters and everything else, occasionally you can get on and think about your business and actually succeeding in doing the thing your business is in place for.
Indeed.
So that's we don't want to frighten people, but these things are in place and you do need to address them.
Yes. Paul, in terms of questions, if I may, now you mentioned before that lawyers love a bit of a paper trail, and you mentioned clearly before that running regular updates or training on the policies and procedures within your business is critical. And as you suggested, well, as you recommended, ensure that attendance is recorded and some of the key points that are discussed during those meetings. Would you suggest anything else that could be deemed as evidence or proof that you've acted in a positive duty manner?
Yeah, well, look, we haven't spent much time on it because most people should be familiar, I think. But if they're not, then addressing complaints or opportunities to disclose issues that are going on is very important. So they shouldn't be ignored. So, for example, any person within your workplace ought to be able to, even if they don't want to formally complain, at least speak to you about what they believe is going on and what may be a problem, and for the employer to address that. So it's important to encourage that. It's not a dobbing or snitching thing. It's really about keeping being aware of what's going on. If someone brings something to your attention and simply says, look, I want to disclose this and let you know what's going on, don't ignore it. Have a look at it. Sometimes you just deal with those in a sensitive and confidential way. But as long as you've done it, make a note in your diary, and that would be good. Even email exchanges say, thanks for that information today, I'm following up. Even if you don't need to put the detail in the email, you've at least got a record that you've acknowledged it.
Yeah, and being emailed, it'd be date and time.
Yeah, that's right, absolutely. And so forth. There's your record.
So there's somewhat of a paper trail. Excellent. Now, Paul, I've got to ask you this, and I know I'm catching you off guard here. With the recent World Cup, of the Women's World Cup, it seems to have got global attention.
Yes.
I think it was the president of the Spanish football club, correct me if I'm wrong, kissed the captain, I think, of the Spanish girls team on the lips. And, it's gone viral. So
it has gone viral.
I'd love to hear your thoughts there.
Look, thanks for raising that. That's in many ways, that's a perfect example, albeit one that's been